All right, this is just my own preamble to the nonsense I've been seeing recently online in all directions. It's just a world of nonsense. This is part of the reason why we need to get past postmodernism, postmodernism and into metamodernism, is because a priori nonsense is accepted as legitimate. My opinion matters more than facts, and more importantly, everyone's doing it in all directions. So it's not even particularly patterned towards one, camp or another. It's everybody's doing it. So I'm not particularly harping on left-wing or right-wing behaviors. I know that's what everyone wants to do. That's another form of cultism. Cultism. I'm just saying cult after cult after cult after cult. How do I define a cult? So there's two different ways to define cults. The more popular way to define cults is that you basically have some charismatic leaders who convince you to buy into a radical perspective of the world because it makes you initially feel good to belong to some special perspective, makes you feel like you're enlightened, whereas everybody else is in the dark. And then by escalating commitment, they get you to cut ties with all people who might convince you otherwise. And then it becomes very much an insular behavior where basically you find yourself surrounded by other people who share exactly the same opinions. And so you feel as if there's all this validation of reality. And then eventually all you ever see is people repeating the same beliefs. And so it becomes reified as true for you. And so in the isolation of having any competing beliefs or any motivation to disagree, you end up basically going all the way down into a madness. Okay. That is the definition that I prefer. The second definition focused specifically on religious cults and has more to do with the content of the cults rather than the process. And this is important too, because the content matters. Cults usually have several main components in their content. First of all, they have unusual sexual opinions. Either they are extremely prohibitive of sex or extremely permissive of sex, or they turn sexual coercion into a positive thing instead of a negative thing if it's like BDSM, that kind of stuff. Well, basically the idea is this, that what they do is they change the rules of taboo, and they give you a new understanding of reality by which those taboos are now the glue or the acceptable behaviors, as opposed to being the dismissive, the dangerous behaviors. And so sexuality is almost like 90% of cults have a radical sexual position on something. Number two, the cults have a position that basically create a hierarchy that is usually labeled as equality. Okay, so this is where the cult leaders will basically convince you that everybody is equal inside the cult, and this is always the case. We're all family, we're all equal, except some are more equal than others. And here's the rules by which all of us equal people gain authority over specific things. And so radicalism in politics basically follows this norm as well. And then the third aspect of a cult is that there has to be some sort of enemy of the cults. There must be some sort of very clear and present danger, usually on the scale of the world, sometimes smaller, but usually world level or existential level. There's an existential enemy of the cult. And what the cult leaders will try to do is to groom you into fighting those enemies. And this is especially true for radical politics that is embedded within religion, such as when the Taliban were grooming people to fight the United States as if the United States was literally Satan. And so therefore, by any means necessary for fighting the great season, Satan is justified because Satan is the deeper evil always. So anyway, cultism runs rampant. There's the fourth important ideology point of a cult is anti-science. Basically, there is no objective truth. Nobody can help you find it. Those people are all liars. Those people are all tainted. There's nothing good to know in a formal organization, especially formal scientific organization. Those things are all utterly manipulative, and you can't trust any of it. So this is a very, very popular way to hook people into cults, is to basically say, you can't trust anybody's facts but ours. And the reason to trust our facts is not because of your ability to empirically verify those facts. The reason that you should trust our facts is because of our intentions and because of our charisma. That basically we're just more emotionally compelling. So we're going to manipulate you based on feelings, and also based on exploiting your general belief that all of reality is a false construct, and that only secret knowledge can be used against this sort of public false narrative. Okay, so we have the process theory of cults, where basically they incrementally separate you, and it's like how you do cultism. And then we have the content theory of cultism, which is basically what the content of those beliefs are that are attracting people and drawing them into the cult. Now, there's a further a definition that I like to put on cults, that which is basically the zombie theory of cults. Okay, and it goes a little bit further. It's the NPC theory. You'll hear these sorts of terminologies in left-wing and right-wing discourse. You know, NPCs have been picked up by the right, and zombies sometimes by the left. And the basic idea is this. They're trying to convince you that everybody else is a walking dead, that basically they're all homogeneous sheeple, shills, whatever, and that basically there's a world is run by wolves and sheep, or basically zombies and zombie overlords, and that basically the good people are those people who don't fit that walking dead. And there's a very good reason for this metaphor. It's not enough to simply say they're stupid. That's not nearly good enough. What they're trying to suggest to you is that the ideas that are operating their brains are like zombie ideas. So you've been infected by the zombie virus, you know. So it's not simply because you're stupid, it's because you have adopted dead beliefs which don't live, beliefs which are basically false life, animation of the dead. So and where this comes from is the argument that science progresses, okay, and that there are some older beliefs that are dead lines of reasoning, okay, like early Marxism, for example. There are variations of Marxism today that still keep popping up to try to like repair the dead lines of reasoning. But it is generally accepted, even in the Marxist community, that some of the earliest lines of reasoning of Marxism led to Stalin and Mao and totalitarian fascism dressed up as if it were communism. And then they say there's never been any real communist countries because those were all fascist movements lying to us. Well, that means that the lines of reasoning which produced that kind of authoritarian communism are dead lines of reasoning. No one would intentionally promote them. They are purely manipulative. And so even a Marxist would tell you I wouldn't promote that. Okay. So now here's where I come into play, and I say that my theory of zombie cultism is that every cult is a reanimation of an idea that is dead according to the progress of science. That basically there are kinds of woo-woo or beliefs that at one time in history were considered to be relevant, active, and plausible. This, for example, extreme interpretations of Freudian theory, where everything literally is sex in the brain. So, for example, early Freudianism, when he was on cocaine, he made very clear statements in his early writings that he believed that neurons were basically sexual entities that operated according to evolutionary mechanisms, and that he believed that every neuron was embedded with a particular substance that basically generated erotic energy, and that was the energy of the brain, and that was the fundamental unit of brain operation, was this sort of like erotic energy in the brain. And that therefore this would explain why everything outwardly in human behavior and animal behavior is also erotic. Okay. Now he moved away from this, as did, everybody sane, when they started recognizing that the brain was more complicated than that. And that was a all too convenient theory for a complex world. And you will notice that his argument was a radical simplification. It was a dumbing down of the complexity. This is part of cult behavior. Cult behavior is always about dealing with a complex world. It's always about trying to find some sort of dogma or recipe or simplified set of rules that help us to cope with complexity. This goes all the way down to the cultist popular insistence that we take certain herbal supplements or eat a certain weird simplified diets. That's very common in cults. Sexual behaviors are also justified, radical sexual behaviors, along simply radical interpretations of how the reality works and how interpersonal energies flow and that kind of mumbo jumbo. So there's always a justification. They never just tell you arbitrarily to do things. They always tell you there's like this deep, radically simple explanation that would justify this weird behavior. Okay, so now I find myself today dealing with zombie theories. They're shuffling all around the globe like Walking Dead. Why is this happening? As people are being radicalized and convinced that the world is a terrible place and it's collapsing and it's all disorder and chaos and mumbo jumbo, and every major institutional structure is to be mistrusted. This is the media doing. This is not actually something that we're all inherently observing. This is basically, we're being conditioned on a daily basis on social media and mainstream media to be told that nothing works and don't trust anybody except us. Problem is, it's creating a general mistrust, and nobody's even trusting those people who are telling you not to trust anyone else. And so cults are exploding everywhere. And so everyone is digging up old ideas, and they're going back and looking at early psychology and early philosophy and early rigid hierarchies and radical simplifications and reductions. Oh, everything is mimesis. Well, that's a cult. It's not true. It was proven a long time ago scientifically to be false. And we have superior philosophies that are far beyond the idea that everything is mimesis. It's a stupid idea. It's just as stupid as the claim that Freud originally made that everything is erotic energy in the brain. Even he admitted that it was more to it than that as he progressed. And so, even Carl Jung admitted that a lot of his ideas, he had science ideas, and then he had speculative ideas. And of course, the woo-woo people harped on the speculative ideas and dismissed his science. They didn't even read his science or retain it. They just marched right to the speculative ideas. what is this all about? What this is this need for religion, this need for the mystery and magic, and the belief that there is something, there's some sort of mystery that the rational world is suppressing. And so everybody's running in all these crazy directions, looking for this like replacement for religion, replacement for mystery. And of course, they're finding cults, recreating cults. Oh, utopian cultism is the two biggest kinds are utopian cultism and occultism. Okay, utopian cultism is the belief that if we develop these sort of radical philosophies, that we would be able to create better worlds and better, ways of interpreting reality, and it would help us to understand the complexity that we're dealing with. And so then the occultists believe that there's ways that you can use mind over matter, and that basically, even in a atheistic world, there's occultists who basically are derived from the self-empowerment world, the life coaching and self-empowerment and Esalen Institute type of stuff, and neurolinguistic programming. Manipulative techniques that were developed for salespeople and sociopaths and con artists are then being taught as life lessons, so that you can always be empowered, as if that was the automatic good. And that's any form of empowerment is its own justification of good. And so this is just nonsense. So basically what we're looking at here is occultism running rampant on the internet, with everyone claiming that, if you take the right drugs, or if you follow the right meditative practices or whatever, you too will be ubermensch, and everybody's doing it. Then you have people reinterpreting classic psychology and then trying to make religions out of it. You have people reinterpreting Gene Gebser and Graves and stuff and trying to make a quasi-religious interpretation of spiral dynamics, putting way too much of their thought, time, and energy into it, as if it were some sort of teleological explanation for life and existence and humanity, rather than for its original purpose, which is to perform analysis. Theories written by academics were not originally written to be anti-science. They were originally written as theories to go with the grain of science. Freud was not anti-science. Freud was fucking science for quite a while. He wrote his theories to go with the grain of science. And then eventually these theories hit a wall where they no longer go with the grain. They are falsified. The systems fail to hold up to empirical scrutiny. The world moves on scientifically. So what happens? Cultists go back, dig up these theories, reify them as if they are scientifically valid. They do it from an armchair perspective. And then whenever you bring up empirical facts or try to falsify, they tell you that's not admissible evidence. We don't do empiricism here. That's mental. To actually claim that empirical science is not admissible evidence into a philosophical conversation is exactly how cults are formed. What they do is they detach you from your own eyes do not count as admissible evidence. The only thing that counts as admissible evidence is the cult leader's words and interpretations. Ideas before eyes, ideas before people, ideas, fetishism, radicality. This is how you try to convince people that dead ideas should be reanimated and that we should be zombies and follow zombie cults. And the bizarre thing is that this is the norm currently. We're going through a cult period of history. This recurs at regular intervals, and I'm going to tell you exactly why. Cultural paradigms shift. The shifts are messy. They're not clean and neat. Scientific paradigms, when they change, they're relatively clean shifts. The entire scientific community sometimes wakes up and says, We need to restructure our fundamentals here and realign. And that's what happened when Einstein came along, for example. And right now, we're going through that with complexity science. And right now, complexity science is becoming the new norm in scientific paradigm. It hasn't penetrated all aspects of the university, but it is slowly and steadily becoming the new fundamentals of various different disciplines. So as we're going through this shift, people are panicking in some sense, the people who don't understand it, and especially the people who fear math, because it is a math-heavy perspective. The quantification of complexity scares the piss out of people who are bad at math. And what they do is they cling to cults that are verbal. And so they go back to these old theories that were written in plain verbiage or sometimes in obscure verbiage. Those are even more dangerous. The obscure verbal theories are where you really get cults, because then you need the interpreters. You need this sort of priesthood who interprets, the obscure philosophers for the rest of people, and then they become the cult leaders. So anyway, basically everyone digs up all these easy to understand wrong ideas, and they declare them solace because, hey, I at least can understand it, and therefore it must be true. Okay, so at the bottom of all this is narcissism. The cultural shift between postmodernism and metamodernism is very messy. It hasn't been neat and clean at all. What happens is people usually bring a lot of baggage with them at first, and over the first decade or two of cultural shift, it's a total mess. Well, as we're going through this shift, cults are popping up like wildfire of people who basically are trying to get in early on the cultural innovation game and trying to declare themselves early interpreters and leaders of the new world, the new metamodernism and so forth. And so every cult you can imagine is blooming inside this conversation as people are jockeying for position and jockeying for followers and attention for the radical cults of metamodernism. Eventually, metamodernism will become mainstream and the ideas will be normalized. But right now, everyone's running nuts trying to exploit the confusion. And so this has happened in regular intervals. This happened when we went through a transition between modernity and postmodernity. Everyone remembers the 60s, okay? The 1940 through 1970, it was almost 30 years. Well, I'm going to go from the end of World War II. There was a radical scramble to try to create cults to help us to explain the world after the collapse of modernity, and communism, capitalism, and fascism all proved to show warts and ugliness in the way they were originally formulated, which led to World War II. This is because they were too radical. The radical communism, fascism, and capitalism failed. So what we did is, from a scientific perspective, is we de-radicalized our ways of running societies. And this opened up the door for culture to be examined and for us to de-radicalize culture as well, so that we could have a broader set of what counts as normal, but also be more excluding of those radical cults at the extreme, which we established to be very bad. And so there was a whole lot of cultism in the 60s where we sorted out what was acceptable and what wasn't. Well, we're doing the same thing now. The cultists are at it in full force. They're taking advantage of confusion. They're taking advantage of the delayed understanding in the paradigm shift from postmodernism to metamodernism and from empirical science to complexity science. And most especially, they're taking advantage of people's ignorance of science and mathematics and running with it. And so far as to condemn anyone who would dare tell you that science works or that math works. Math that would invalidate their claims, science which would justify what we already know to be true. And that is why this is the big red flag. If you notice anyone trying to say Science is not admissible evidence. We don't trust science here. Philosophy should work against the grain of science, not with it. These are people who are radically misunderstanding even their own justifying literatures, because Freud would never agree with that. Jung would never agree with that perspective, or even Rene Girard would never agree with the perspective that we were supposed to be working against the grain of science and to not take science as admissible evidence. They all took science as admissible evidence. They all intended to work with science. Anyone who says otherwise is a cult leader or a cult member, okay? So anyone who's trying to tell you that their new interpretation of old dead lines of reasoning are immune from scientific scrutiny is absolutely crazy and also dangerous. Yes, I am a fan of revisiting old ideas. I am a fan of looking at neo-Austrian perspectives in economics or neo-Marxist perspectives of environmentalism or something, but not in the broad cultish sense, in the sense that there are individual points made by the Austrians that are still valid in certain contexts, and those points need to be rehabilitated. Individual points made by Marxist analysis of structure and superstructure, and the dialectics of history that are still valid and need to be understood. But the systems as a whole were failures, and we should never ever allow these cultists to get us to believe that the systems were not failures, and that it was just that society repressed it or fought it off, and that we live in a radically subjective world. That is cultism. Are there any good kinds of cults or benign cults? Okay, before I end this video, let me say, yes, cults can be benign and serve positive purposes, but not when they are directly trying to form exclusive relationships, to be recruits or evangelize, to try to scale themselves up to big places. Cults are artistic experiments in the best case scenario, where the people who join them know they are flawed, know that they don't necessarily function, but they are an interesting experiment. As an example, the earliest work of the radical artists, Genesis Breyer Porridge, was exactly that. It was an artistic experiment, a planned activity where artists who knew they were doing something weird and radical wanted to see the limits of the human mind and to see whether or not they could actually unearth through experimentation new ways of understanding and knowing. And so, for example, Genesis had set up a house and a living situation where he and another person were experimenting with breaking every convention, every gender role, every, we wake up in the morning and go to bed at night, we eat breakfast like this, we do our laundry like this. They went through a radical experiment of trying to smash every single assumption that we live in our normal life. That kind of cultish experimentation has incredible value. It is a scientific activity, because then we know that we are isolating the facts, that we are learning from it as an experiment. That's okay. That is actually very important to progress in humanity, is people willing to be guinea pigs on themselves to see what happens when you experiment with cultish arrangements. This is not the same thing as people who are generally promoting cults as if there is no experimental design. And most cults are like that. So utopianism and experimental design is important. And we have places in Europe where they do that, where we say, well, can we do a utopian laboratory and set up a type of living arrangement using different kinds of money, or different or no money at all, or that sort of thing, Again, if they know that they're conducting experiments and that they're probably going to fail, but there's a chance they succeed, I'm all for it. We need lots of those sorts of things to be able to advance society. We need to challenge our assumptions. On the other hand, we have people spreading around quasi-religious or even straight flat out religious cults telling you it's not an experiment, it's just simply truth. And this is extremely dangerous, and I will push back against any of that. So long story short, this is like the main idea that we need to be addressing as we have a transition from postmodernism to metamodernism, is sorting out the cult from the reality, sorting out the scientifically justifiable experiments in culture versus the dangerous, these aren't even experiments, the dangerous zombie cults in cultural change. Thank you. And that's what I'm going to be talking about more in the near future.